A large amount of work in Photoshop always relies on selections being made on a particular image and then using that selection to make some changes to that particular area by changing the color or maybe applying a filter or some other work that we might want to do. But as selections are incredibly important. When we're talking about selections in the context of an image manipulation piece of software that is as powerful as Photoshop is, we have to keep in mind that selections in different parts of an image is much harder or much more demanding than, let's say, selections in a word processor like Microsoft Word, for instance. In a word processor, you've only got a very straightforward selection object, which is text on a page. So we can just take our mouse, move over to a paragraph and click and drag, and it's very obvious for Microsoft Word to realize what we're trying to select. It just selects the text and that's straightforward enough. When we're talking about an image in Photoshop, for instance, well, it's much harder for Photoshop to realize exactly what we want to select, because it doesn't have definite words that it knows that are the only type of thing that we want to select or the only type of objects that we want to select. When we're talking about images, we have to be very kind of specific to Photoshop to say it's a particular object that I want to select in a particular way. Because selections in Photoshop are less straightforward than the word processor, we need more tools to allow us to select in an appropriate way. And in fact, Photoshop has 9 different selection tools for us to choose from. So we're going to start today with just the very basic type of selection tool, which is the first selection tool that I see on my toolbar, and that is the Marquee tool. And it's got the icon here with just a dashed square box on that icon. So if I click on that tool, I'll have the Marquee selection tool selected. Now, just to keep in mind, this icon has got a little black triangle down the bottom right hand corner of the icon. So that means there are other variations of the Marquee selection tool, and I can get them by clicking and holding down my mouse. And so I can see I've got a rectangular marquee tool, I've got an elliptical marquee tool, and then I've got ones that aren't used as often but are still quite useful, a single row marquee tool and single column marquee tool. So let's go to our just basic rectangular marquee tool and let's see how it works. So first of all, when I move over my image, a lot of these different tools in the toolbar in Photoshop, I see different icons that work as my mouse cursor. So I can see the rectangular marquee tool just shows me a very simple crosshairs. And wherever I start clicking and dragging with my mouse, once the marquee rectangular tool is on, I can see that I just get a dash border around, and that is showing that at any stage when I let go of my mouse, that will be what will be selected. Once the selection is made, I can see this white and black dashed line that moves around the perimeter of the selection area, and this is known as a marching black ant line. And if I click and drag again, I just get a new selection. And I can change the selection as many times as I want. And when I'm happy with whatever selection that I have, I can then go ahead and apply different Photoshop features to that particular area. Before we move on to that, let's look at some of the other different types of marquee selection tools that are available. So the second one down here in this submenu is the elliptical marquee tool. So if I click on that, again, it's what we would expect. Instead of getting a rectangle for a selection, I get an ellipse or an oval. And again, if I click again, I just get a new selection. So I click and drag every time, and it widens out the selection to the space that I want to select. I still get the marching black ant line around the perimeter as well, and the cursor still takes the form of a simple crosshairs. Now, this selection tool, it's an ellipse or an oval that gets generated. What happens if I want to get a perfect circle? Instead of trying to eyeball it and trying to guess it by clicking and dragging myself and trying to keep the actual ellipse in a circular form, there's a very handy feature that is in Photoshop and a lot of other different applications as well that allow me to click and drag for selections. But if I hold down my Shift key on my keyboard while I'm clicking and dragging, it will ensure that the ellipse created is a perfectly uniform circle. So I'm holding down my Shift key here. As soon as I let go of my Shift key, while still clicking and dragging, I can see that it snaps out into an ellipse again. But if I hold down my Shift key again, it snaps it back into a uniform circle. And so that's how to get a perfectly uniform circular selection in Photoshop. Let's move on to the last two marquee selection tools that are in this selection submenu. And so I see a single row marquee tool and a single column marquee tool. Now, as I said before, these are ones that aren't used as much as the first two, rectangular and elliptical, but they're still useful when certain situations arise. So just picking the single row marquee tool, if I move out into my image and I just do a simple click, I see a very, very thin row that's selected across the center of my image. And I can see the marching black ant line there. It doesn't look as if anything is selected, but if I zoom in a little bit here, and again I'm doing that by holding down the Alt key on my keyboard and using my mouse wheel, I can see a single line of pixels being selected there. So we can see that's what it does. It selects a single line of pixels across my image. And it's the same as you would expect for a single column marquee tool as well. Instead of selecting a single row, I just get a single column of pixels selected. So again, in certain situations that can become very, very handy to do. And that's the last of my marquee selection tools in Photoshop. And I can see again, just to recap, I had the rectangular marquee tool, very useful, elliptical marquee tool, and then I've got single row marquee tool and single column marquee tool as well. Just note on these different selection tools as well, and any of these different tools in the toolbar in Photoshop. Sometimes on particular features, particular tools, I see individual letters beside them. So for instance, in the marquee tool, it has a little letter M. Those are keyboard shortcuts that if I'm on a different tool anywhere in my toolbar and I hit the letter M, if you keep an eye over here on my toolbar and see what happens, I'm going to press the letter M now, it switches back to the marquee tool. So it's just a nice simple shortcut. Instead of actually leaving my image, if I'm working with the mouse over in this area, going and finding my tool, perhaps clicking on it and getting a different option of the type of tool, and then going back and working in my image again, if I just hit the actual keyboard shortcut on my keyboard, it's a lot easier and a lot faster.